Today, we have Sam Arbesman on the show. He has written a book called The HalfLife of Facts, Why Everything We Know Has an Expiration Date. And this book is particularly interesting to me and this podcast because I'm often looking for the truth. What is the truth, right? With the Social Good book series, I've been asking, what is the best way that we could do good in our lives? Like, is there a metric or something that I can, put myself up to, this way of living? I'm looking for that truth I put my teeth into. And same thing with nutrition. I'm working on this nutrition book series, which we're going to be hitting pretty soon. We'll be doing that. And with that, the question is, well, what is the best way to eat? And now Sam, with his book, The HalfLife of Facts, says, you know what? There is no truth. The truth is always changing, and it has been. And I'm thinking, well, that's really damn confusing. So I brought Sam here on the show to talk about what is the truth, why is it always changing, and how can we, predict the future better? And that is what Sam does. Aside from being here on the podcast and writing books, Sam has a life outside of here where he is the scientist in residence at a VC firm called Lux Capital. And that is exactly what he does with his time. He predicts emerging technology systems that are on the edge of, what we know. So finding the new startups, finding the new companies that are really kind of breaking the boundaries. He also has a new book coming out. So yes, you listening, get 2 books in this episode. 2 for the price of 1. His new book coming out is called, I make myself laugh sometimes. That's for me. Overcomplicated is the name of his book. Overcomplicated Technology at the Limits of Comprehension. So later in this episode, he and I will be talking about his new book as well, and that is about systems and how things are getting so complicated now that people, you and me, we don't even know how to undo we're so many layers above the technology, basically. So how do we understand these behaviors better? How do we understand these systems that we're using better? That's more or less what I got out of it. See what you get out of it. So 2 books for the price of 1 on books. I'm really happy to have Sam here joining me in the studio. So I want to welcome Mr. Sam Arbesman. So I want to talk about the book HalfLife of Facts. In the book, you claim that everything we know has an expiration date. What does that mean?
So essentially what it means is that we all know, at least somewhat intuitively, that the information in the textbooks we had when we were kids is no longer completely accurate anymore. And the world changes as well as our knowledge and understanding of the world. And so there are some cases where it's the very facts change, like how many billions of people there are on the planet. That has changed over time.
Right.
But there's also other things in terms of our understanding of. So, for example, so my grandfather, who's actually he's a retired dentist. He's turning 99 this summer. When he was in dental school, he actually learned the wrong number of human chromosomes that are in a single cell. He learned 48 instead of 46 because there was a period, I think, for about several decades where there was this number that was miscounted because they didn't really have very good imaging techniques, and that number just got propagated within the textbooks until I think the mid-1950s when it was corrected, and they realized, oh wait, we actually had been miscounted, and which is kind of now it sounds like, oh my god, it's got a fundamental fact about human biology, and they just got it wrong. But these kinds of things, they happen a lot. And so the book, though, says beneath all that kind of flux, it turns out there are rules and kind of regularities to how knowledge grows, how it changes, how it gets overturned, how we kind of root out error and how it spreads from person to person. And so the book looks at what are these, what are the rules to understanding how knowledge changes over time. And it turns out so there's a number of kind of different related fields within science that actually look at this. So there's the whole field of, it's called scientometrics, which essentially means the science of science, the science of quantifying how science is done. And people have actually looked at the trends and how scientific literature gets cited over time, or how the nature and how people collaborate between institutions, between over distance, and how that affects.
Who's doing this kind of research, like as schools and universities?
So it's in lots of different universities, and it's a mixture of probably a number of different fields. So there's people coming from the social sciences, people coming from information science. Historically, it actually came out of like library science. That's another area. People like applied mathematicians, physicists. They're all kind of involved in understanding this, and like more recently, a lot of people have been referring to it, I think, as like a meta knowledge, like how we actually know what we know and how we learn that. And, like people have looked at whether or not more interdisciplinary teams are more likely to make really groundbreaking research and kind of what that means. And people looking at everything from like within science or the field of invention, or even just kind of how teams are made up and kind of what their output is. And so there's this whole body of literature really trying to understand how we know what we know and how that changes over time. And so the book kind of examines that, like various aspects of how knowledge changes.
I'm trying to think of some more examples of facts that have changed since I was in school. Can you?
So like one example, there's a few kind of like canonical examples like people always talk to me about. Like, so one is just like what dinosaurs look like. So like when I was little, I was proud to remember. Like I was proud to know that dinosaurs were at least some of them were warm-blooded dinosaurs. Yeah. And like because I think everyone had like they were these like slow.
Yeah.
Like cold-blooded.
Like leather skin.
Yeah.
Like
but
big,
I remember.
long.
Yeah. But when I was little though, it's still they were these like kind of like slow plodding reptilian monsters.
Yeah.
And now we know that they're fast moving. Many of them are smaller. They're brightly colored. They have feathers. They're kind of like these almost like fearsome chickens, at least for some of them. And we've totally revamped what dinosaurs look like.
This is news to me.
And it's unbelievable. and so that's like a big one. And so that's really interesting to see.
This is what kids are learning now.
Yeah, they're learning.
Is this in the new Jurassic Park movie? Because I didn't see that yet. But
I don't know. I haven't actually seen the new Jurassic Park
Fact
movie.
check.
But actually, this is often how knowledge changes, or at least how we perceive it. So on the one hand, even though knowledge is changing fairly smoothly over time, like we're learning new things and we're accumulating knowledge, oftentimes the way we perceive it is this like step-like fashion, because we're often not confronted with the new knowledge until, let's say, like our kid comes home and says, "Guess what? Dinosaurs look like chickens," or let's discuss Pluto and whether or not it's a planet. Like all these, and obviously that was like a big news story.
Yeah.
I think no one. I don't think anyone still thinks. Well, I guess there are many people who still want Pluto to be a planet in their hearts, but like they kind of know things have changed in terms of knowledge. But I think, but for the most part, a lot of these facts, until the next generation of textbooks get them, and the next generation of students learn these things and kind of tell the older generation, we don't realize these things have changed. And the problem is because, like when we're young, we're generalists. We're like these little generalists where you're taught a whole bunch about a ton of different topics. And then as you grow older, you specialize. You learn kind of more and more about your own specific tiny little area. And that's great for your own area. But as soon as you jump outside of the area, you often, you don't realize, but you're often relying on information that might be decades out of date because that's when you learned it. And so, in terms of and the one good thing though I think is about with the internet, like people always say, oh, like the fact that you can Google all these facts, it's ruining our memories. I actually think it's great because if you're not entirely sure what a fact is and you look it up, you're more likely to get a more up-to-date fact than something that's very out of date. And so this way you can kind of more readily maintain and update what you had in your head, because a lot of things are changing pretty rapidly. There have been quite a number of new elements added to the periodic table since I learned chemistry in middle school.
I didn't know they could change that.
Oh yeah, they add them. They add them on a pretty
I would probably
basis. Yeah.
fail second grade science at this point, or math, or any of those. That's fascinating. Are there some facts that you think are right now are on their way out? Are there some things that are being contested? Is this something that you're thinking about often, or because you wrote the book? It's been a few years now since the book first came out.
Oh, so you mean in terms of facts that have? And so one of the things that I've actually been very excited to see since I wrote the book.
Yeah.
So I think I even might have discussed this, might have mentioned in the book, where a lot of times in research and kind of just the world of science, the incentives for reproducing someone's research and actually checking to see whether or not the results hold up and are kind of as robust as we think they are, the incentives are not necessarily there, because let's say you replicate someone's research correctly, then that person is praised
Gets
because
the
it's like,
praise.
oh, like that, like the research is robust. And if you find out, and like, unless it's like a really big result, if you find out it's like spurious, then you're just like, okay, whatever. It's kind of like a negative thing, or it's not like the incentives are not necessarily there because it's not necessarily original research. You're just kind of like checking someone else's thing that was already there. Since I've written the book, though, there's actually been a huge amount of awareness around reproducibility in science, and actually making sure that we really, because one of the other things is like increasingly as science has become more computationally driven, and like there's like simulations, or there's a whole bunch of work that is required to run an experiment that's not really in the scientific paper. People realize you can't actually reproduce research, and so people have been trying to make this like make science not only more reproducible, but actually trying to reproduce things. And so, especially in the social sciences, a lot of people have actually been looking at a number of like really famous results and trying to see if they can reproduce. And in some cases, sometimes they actually can't find that these things these things don't actually hold up. But yeah, so I am excited to see that when it comes to science and reproducibility, there's been a lot of work trying to see if certain research stands the test of time.
Yeah.
And so it's not even necessarily just a single result. It's like the fact of like people are now much more explicitly engaging with this topic, which is wonderful to see.
Yeah, I think a lot about like what truth means, and I have not studied philosophy. I know I'm sure there's whole majors and books written about Aristotle and all that stuff, what truth is. But oftentimes there's so much information out there nowadays, especially, that it's so overwhelming. One niche I would say that really affects me is food science and food nutrition, because not only is there a lot of information, but portion of it is highly marketed and explosive in your face all the time, and often, but it seems it's like the science behind it is dubious. Is there things as a consumer that we can do or that you do in your life to make sense of all the information that's out there, the truthiness of it?
So that's actually a really good question. I think that's another area where you see a lot of like knowledge kind of changing, and like a lot of flux happening with nutrition, or even like information about like how to take care of babies, and like there's always like new information on a daily basis. And I think the way to view that is more a new result, or a result that overturns something. That's the kind of thing that's going to be reported in the news. So the news, when it comes to science and like nutrition especially, they're not reporting on like the core of knowledge, like the things that don't change. They're reporting on things that are at the frontier, like the new things we're learning. And of course, like as a necessity, the frontier is where we know the least, where the science is least settled. And so there's going to be a lot of flux and a lot of churn at that place. And oftentimes that's going to be like, it's going to be a lot of churn at like the edges of things. And so like, for example, like I don't think we're going to ever discover that like consuming lettuce is like a horrible thing, or like something like cyanide is really healthy for you. Like these things are like pretty well settled. Like we kind of know about them. But at the edges of like, okay, how do we balance certain nutrients and things like that? I think that's where a lot of the flux is happening. And so I think if you kind of bear in mind the fact that like we kind of know the basics of like what is healthy and what is not, or like in like childcare of like what we should, like how we should take care of babies and what we shouldn't, like we kind of know like the basic things of like what to do and what really not to do.
Yeah. And
it's really at the edges, at like where the science is least settled. That's where you see a lot of changing. And I think it's hard for people to sometimes distinguish between that core and the frontier, because only the frontier is the stuff that's being reported on in the news. And so that's kind of the trouble. And I think once you're kind of more aware of that, it allows you to say, okay, I can like put this in perspective. I can certainly be aware of like the most cutting edge research, but first of all, it might be worth like kind of looking at like the underlying paper as opposed to the way it's reported in the popular press, which oftentimes there's a fairly large disconnect. But then also just recognize that like you can like look to the most cutting edge research, but recognize that because it's at the frontier, it might very well be overturned, and like that's just part of science. I mean, like science and like the area where we know the least is often, and like that's the most exciting. Like that's why the scientists work at the frontier, and things might change, and a lot of scientists like take pride in being able to kind of like change their minds about what they thought was true, because like science is not a body of knowledge; it's a means of querying the world. And so even though all the knowledge might be changing, or some of it might be changing over time, the mechanism for querying the world, that's the science, and like that thing doesn't change.
Yeah, it's almost like I want there to be like some kind of like I almost like want science to get to this truth. I'm like, when do we get to the thing?
Like, we're always like asymptotically approaching it. We're never going to quite get there, but we're doing really well. And
you mentioned.
So that being said, though, and so there's this concept in philosophy of science. It's called like the pessimistic meta-induction of science.
What's
it's
that?
like a big mouthful. But the idea is that like we, on the one hand, we think we like we're really like we know like the way the world really works now. Like we've like gotten really close to understanding like the nature of physics and things like that. But then again, like so did previous generations, and like they weren't necessarily right. And so it's just kind of like a certain amount of like humility in recognizing there's always more to learn. At the same time, though, so there's a great quote that Isaac Asimov has where he's like talking about like understanding the shape of the Earth.
Okay. Yeah.
And he said like it's like yeah, like the Earth is not flat. It's also not like perfectly a sphere. But like they're not equally wrong. Like the flat Earth is like much more incorrect than like than like the perfectly sphere Earth, and you can actually look at like the amount of error and like the deviation from the true shape is a lot bigger on the flat Earth. And I think that's the way to think about it. Like yes, our theories are changing, but we're actually getting closer like at all times, and that's part of science is willingness to kind of re-examine assumptions and keep on getting closer and closer. And sometimes it's just kind of like, sometimes it's like figuring out kind of the next decimal place to really make sure we understand something. And sometimes it's actually overturning a theory that gets us closer. And sometimes the theory might, in the end, just kind of change that decimal place, but it will also change kind of our perspective on the world. In this case, like with the shape of the Earth, that really changed how we thought about our own planet. And I think that's the way to think about it. Like we're kind of constantly getting closer, even though we'll probably never approach it, and that's okay. Like that's what makes science fun. That's why people continue wanting to do it.
I love that. I think that's the best example, and it gives hope. It gives that we are moving, toward a world where we're not going to wake up one morning and be like, nope, everything you knew about lettuce was wrong.
Yeah, we don't have to worry about that.
Because there's a lot of anxiety with that when you wake up and then it's like milk causes cancer. Milk is great for you. It just every day it just seems like things are changing. But I guess if you look at it. I have a visual in my head, and I think it comes from cybernetics, or it's like heat-seeking missiles. You're like kind of goes to the left, goes too far to the right, but it's constantly getting closer.
Like the oscillations get smaller.
The
and
oscillations
kind of as you get closer,
are getting closer to some kind of target.
Yeah.
So
that's a good way to think about it.
This is kind of I think about in my head. It's funny, like talking about like moving into the future and this kind of search for the truth. It reminds me of I think it was William Gibson, and he has this quote: "The future." What is it? The future's already here, but it's not evenly distributed.
Yes.
You ever hear that?
Yeah.
Do you think that the future is somewhere on this planet that somebody is like in Japan? Like, I mean, that's like the the trope, right? It's like somewhere in Japan or like in a lab in Stanford. Do you see hints of the future somewhere that we should be looking?
Well, I guess it kind of depends like what aspect of the future. And there's so many different parts of the future. And I think. Like we're really good at extrapolating what we have now. And so if you look at like science fiction stories in general, they extrapolate what we have now out. And so if you look at like the science fiction stories from the 50s or the early 60s, they extrapolated space travel out. In this case, not particularly effectively, but they entirely missed like the entire information revolution. And so I think it's less a matter of like just being able to kind of extrapolate trends that everyone is seeing, and more like pick out like the really weird things that that people are playing with. And I think there was someone, I can't remember who it was, but they were talking about how like one of the ways they kind of think about like where the world is going is they look at really smart people, especially kind of like technically minded people, what they do with their free time, like in their hobbies. Like that's often like the predictor of what people will do like in 10, 20 years, like for their jobs. And like, I think it might've been some VC who was thinking about that. But it was like a really interesting way to think about that oftentimes like initially the things that become like things that eventually kind of become part of our world, they're really just people playing. And like they're kind of playing around with something cool.
It's
like,
not as planned as we
I
might like
so.
to believe it to be. That makes a lot of sense.
That makes it exciting.
It does make it. It reminds me of I heard Kevin Kelly talking about how in China I think they're trying to find the startups are trying to find their niche, and maybe this plays to your point of like what kind of future you're looking to push the boundaries of. And he was saying over there, like, I think they really want to own VR is like one of the things that they're like clearly trying to focus on. And so maybe, I don't know, maybe that's just like, I mean, I talk to a lot of startups, here in New York City, and it's interesting to see like what things people are working on and what things are the new trends and what things come and go.
Well, I would say, and so one area I am very interested in is thinking about, and I wrote a little article about this, like taking, like when people talk about like, oh, like coding and programming is magic. There's like there's like the one sense of like things just kind of work, like they're kind of magical, like an Apple product is one of, but there's the other idea of that through text you're essentially changing the world around you. You're actually doing something that you write something and it does something, like in the way of like a sorcerer like writes a spell and it does something. And I think taking that analogy seriously and seeing where it breaks down, and it breaks down in many places, and where it doesn't. And increasingly there's many areas that are being kind of dematerialized, and like code is allowing you to do these things in the real world. And one really cool area is in the world of biology, where and there are companies that are developing ways of like you can write a computer program and it will actually enact an entire biological experiment through like robotic automation and like do things do things on bacteria. And you can just write it like from the comfort of your home, and all these things will be happening in the cloud. And I think there's a lot of really, really interesting potential there to, in terms of what is possible with science.
So like write code and then have a biological, like a tree grows in the Amazon, or like a baby is born.
We're not quite there yet.
Eyes.
But so not only could you do some really cool things,
yeah.
but going back to like the reproducibility stuff, like now, like if you have a computer program that does some scientific experiment, you just rerun it. Like you don't have to worry about like all kind of the human element or someone not explaining everything in like the methods portion of a paper. It's just like you press enter and then boom, like the entire thing happens again. And we're not quite there of like press return and like some tree is being grown in some jungle. But that'd be pretty cool. But we're getting there.
Cool.
And the future is cool.
The future's cool, man. We have an early copy here of Overcomplicated.
Yes.
Is this exciting?
It is very exciting.
It's
exciting to have it out in the real world.
Yeah. So Overcomplicated, it comes out on July 19th.
Yes.
Tell me about it.
Sure. So it's Overcomplicated, subtitle Technology at the Limits of Comprehension. And it's essentially about how we are increasingly building technologies that are complicated, but so complicated that no one really understands how they work anymore, even if you're one of the experts who works with them on a daily basis, or even if you're one of the people who built them. And so the book looks at what are the forces that have led us to this point of incomprehensibility, and what do? Do we just say, like, uh-oh, we're in trouble? Or are there kind of more productive ways of like actually meeting our technology halfway?
What are some technologies that are overcomplicated? Is it like an example would be like I'm talking into a microphone right now and I don't know how to make a microphone? Is that an example?
So certainly, and certainly because of like division of labor and specialization, that's one aspect of it. But it's even other things of like the fact that large computer programs have millions or tens of millions or sometimes hundreds of millions of lines of code, and there's no way you can understand all the different ways that systems interact. And of course, through abstraction and various aspects of modularity, we can reduce the amount of incomprehensibility, but because these systems are becoming so complex, like so large and so interconnected, and so like that we eventually lose the ability to fully understand them, and which is not surprising. There's like the way we build our technologies, and I'm using technology fairly broadly. It can be everything from like a piece of software, it could be the entire internet, it could be like urban infrastructure, it could be even like a legal code, like legal systems. All these things are kind of like built systems for a purpose, and all of these like there's the way that our brains process the world, and then there's the way that we build these systems, and there's no reason that even though we like to think that the stuff we build is logical and rational, in general, because these things often are built like they kind of accrete over a period of time, and like they're kind of these like messy evolved systems, and we want to increasingly add features, and so things kind of increasingly interact, or we want to handle all the edge cases of some complex system. They end up becoming things that our brains are just not really well built to handle, and because of that, there's that disconnect between what we can think about and the way our technologies work, and then into that gap is like where we get bugs and failures and kind of crazy stuff that happens. And I think for a lot of people, they feel that while that might be true, it's sort of at the edges of our experience, and and it's not. Like these kind of systems, like they're everywhere. They're in our cars, they're on our desktops and our computers, they're in medical devices. Like they kind of like suffuse our society. And on the one hand, that sounds like kind of frightening, but I mean, sophisticated, complex systems are good because they're really powerful and can do lots of things. But I think we just need to be more aware of the limits to actually understanding these systems. And because I think if we can understand that from the start, we'll be a little bit better prepared. And I also like to think there are some ways of kind of like meeting these systems partway and not feeling totally overwhelmed by them.
Yeah. Can you give a few more examples? Like what's another system?
Oh, another. And going back to like the cars. I mean, like if you look at cars, I mean they. Not even self-driving cars, like just kind of regular human-driven cars. Like these have like tens of millions of lines of computer code within them.
Cars have computer code in them.
Oh, sorry. Did I say tens of millions of cars of computer code? Tens of millions of lines of computer code. Tens of millions of lines of computer code. Sorry about that. And
you may have said that. I am just trying to clarify. Like most people don't think about cars being programmed.
Oh yeah.
Like so, what is that?
Cars are like essentially sophisticated computers on wheels, and so you can see this in. So one of the examples I give is about so a number of years ago there was this issue with certain cars made by Toyota. They had this issue called it was unintended acceleration, where they would just kind of accelerate, and in some cases, a number of cases actually people died, and as far as we can tell, it seems as if the complexity, in this case, over complexity of the code was really to blame, where there were just like these things. I mean, they could have built the system in a lot better way, but the system was it's built in such a way that it's way too complex for any person to understand, and so which means then you often have lots of failure modes, and that can be kind of worrisome, these technologies are everywhere.
Is there some lessons in there on how we can, in our jobs, or anyone listening? I mean, is this applicable to the things that we make in our lives as far as, I guess making small, is it to make a smaller system, to make a more simple, to make something that is updatable over time? How do you take this and apply it to
I think
work?
So there's certain aspects in terms of like how to build a system. So yeah, obviously smaller, kind of more modular, like these things are good. Oftentimes the things that you want to make that are powerful, you really can't. You don't have the options for those kind of things. So I think the lessons are more in how we approach the systems we already have, or the ones we end up building that are really big. And so one of the things that I think about and I discuss in the book is the idea that when we look at these big complex technologies, they're messy. They've kind of evolved over time. They almost have this organic quality. People say, they look kind of biological. And so I say, well, let's take that analogy seriously, and with the idea that can we learn from the way biologists approach really complex biological systems, and can we apply some of those like biological thinking to our own technologies? Even though we've built them, can we actually approach a complex technology the way a biologist might approach an ecosystem, for example?
That's fascinating.
I kind of explore some of the different ways that biologists kind of think about these complex systems. Everything from like looking back to the protobiologists of the naturalists who would go out and categorize the natural history of an area, to a certain degree, that's kind of what we do when we have a really complex technology and we're looking at the bugs or all the different things that are kind of either that we don't understand or that are just so much strange. We need we have to kind of recognize that these are complex things. We should categorize, just kind of chronicle the parts of it, or tinker at the edges, because we know these things might. They might react in kind of ways we don't expect. But then there's also the idea of when you have a really complex system, you just play with a simulation of it to kind of really get a sense of the boundaries of how it responds. And so I kind of like the analogy of, obviously SimCity is more simple than a real city, but playing with SimCity kind of gives you a sense of how to play with a really complex thing that can react in highly nonlinear ways. And I think most technologies, when they're really complicated, they end up having these kind of nonlinearities. And I think if we can kind of have a better feel for playing with systems and playing with simulations, we'll be better prepared to deal with these really complex, nonlinear, messy things.
Is there a class or a book, or how do you think most people learn about systems? Because as you're saying this, I can see lots of places in my life where coding for me has been one place where I've learned. I don't even think I stumbled into it because I just wanted to make a website, 10 years ago or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But all of these things that you're talking about, as far as if you make more complexity, you know you're gonna have more bugs. If you make code that no one else can read, in 5 years no one's gonna be able to read it. Just so many different things, all the way from like functions. Do you program at all?
I do.
Okay, yeah. And just writing functions and methods, things that you can reuse and naming. And I have used a lot of those skills, in even just making this podcast. As far as like naming all the episodes, like something's like standard, and I don't know, just having standards and having methods and breaking that down. It's all the way to managing people as well. I mean, I'm starting to see like so many related ways about systems and how you learn that. And but what do you think? I mean, is there a way to learn this?
Related to like when you're talking about like lessons you've learned from programming. I think for me, and when I think about like computer science and programming, like right now, like there's this like current cultural moment where like we're obsessed with like making sure everyone learns how to code, and I think that's important, and it kind of teaches you a new way of thinking. But I think for me, like teaching people like how to code a for loop or a while loop is like that's like far less important than teaching them like the more kind of fundamentals of like computational thinking, essentially like the ideas of like abstraction, and then through using abstraction you can actually manage huge amounts of complexity.
Totally.
Now at the same time, increasingly like with really big systems, abstraction might break down, and that's something to be aware of. But I think when people can better understand like the sort of like the modes of thought in programming, or it gives people a lot better sense of, well, first of all, just the massive complexity of the technologies that we use every day, but also how to manage some of those kinds of things. So I think kind of computational thinking very broadly concerned in terms of like the fundamental ideas is really important.
I think it's so important, and it's something that I try to like, I don't want to say sneak in, but it's part of when I teach, because I do teach programming courses. I try to like get those ideas across, because they speak so much to me, and how the problem solving aspect of it, and also the technologies themselves change. So it's like one of my teachers used to say, like, we're not here to learn like JavaScript. Like you can go to a trade school to learn that, but we're learning how to use this tool to solve problems. And
like for the most part, like once you learn, and like all like computer languages kind of fall into like just like a small number of categories, and kind of like once you learn one of them, you can kind of know like every other like iterative language, like iterative like programming language or whatever it is.
Exactly.
Or like then you can learn like a functional language, and then you know them all, and it's the same kind of thing where you might have to like look up the specific details of like the function names or kind of certain details of the syntax, but you know like the basic structure of how to think about that. And actually, there's the famous computer scientist Edgar Dijkstra. He used to write these unbelievable like manuscripts and like little essays, and he writes a lot about this, where he kind of talks about that like computer science is like it's massively more complicated and like than any other kind of thing, just due to like the levels of like the hierarchical levels that you have to deal with, like down to like a single bit all the way up to like megabytes or gigabytes, and like it's huge orders of magnitude. And he said like, and these are like much larger numbers than like the human mind has normally had to comprehend, and so therefore we need new modes of thinking. And so he actually kind of has this whole like, I think a whole rant where he kind of talks about like, people always talk about like computer programming sort of like writing recipes, and he's like, we should never say this because it's like this totally novel thing. And I think there's like a great deal of power in kind of having that nice kind of metaphor. But he actually writes a lot about kind of these like modes of computational thinking and trying to really understand like what a programmer is doing, and especially because he was writing this like many decades ago when programming was a lot simpler, but as a necessity, it forced you to contend with like really like the ideas of like what computer science and what computer programming really was. So he has like some really cool insights. So his writing is awesome. I highly recommend it.
Say what was his name again?
So Edgar Dijkstra. So it's a Dijkstra.
What was the goal for writing this new book, Overcomplicated: Technology at the Limits of Comprehension?
My goal is less about kind of saying, okay, like here's like very specific like prescriptive ways to think about these systems, and more I'm hoping to kind of provide an orientation for dealing with these complex technologies and systems that really just kind of are everywhere around us in our lives. And for the most part, people are either unaware of it or kind of don't think about it. And I want people to kind of think about it more consciously, but just kind of think about the proper orientation. Actually, and one of the orientations is like, so oftentimes when we have really complex technologies, we're confronted with something really complex, we kind of tend towards two extremes. There's the one extreme of like we freak out and become really afraid of like self-driving cars, they're going to kill us. Or there's the opposite extreme where we almost have this like undue reverence towards our technologies and say like, oh, this algorithm is like beautiful, it's perfect, it's like we'll never fully understand it kind of thing. And I think both of these extremes, they're not good in the sense like they're not productive because they end up cutting off questioning and actually examining the systems as they are. These systems, they're not necessarily malicious, but they're also not perfect. They're just really complicated and messy. And I think kind of that in between is sort of like humble approach to technology of saying, okay, we're never going to fully understand these systems. That's okay, but we can still do our best and kind of have this kind of like constant iterative and tinkering process towards even the systems we ourselves have built. I think that's really the way forward. And so I think that's kind of one of the orientations I want people to come away with when they read the book.
It's like a humbling kind of factor.
Yeah, and in some way, so actually I even quote, so there's a philosopher from the Middle Ages, Moses Maimonides, and so he wrote this book, The Guide to the Perplexed, and in it he talks about how like there are certain things we'll never understand, and like that's okay, like there are limits. And I think kind of since like the scientific revolution, we've sort of like I would say we've kind of moved away from this idea that like there are things we're never going to fully understand, because we almost have this like and I would say that the most extreme version is this like triumphalist attitude towards knowledge, like if we kind of put our minds to something, we're going to understand everything. And we're increasingly realizing like certain aspects of science, we can't do that. And even within the technologies we've built, we can't do that. And I think returning to this like humble kind of humble approach to technology is can actually be very productive, because it allows us to recognize that there will still be limits, but we can still have a way forward in understanding these things.
I love that. That's really cool.
Thank you.
Well, I'm really excited to read it. I'm so happy that you brought an advance copy.
Thank you.
Cool. I feel special. Yeah, it sounds super exciting, and I feel like we hit a lot of good stuff, man. I feel good. How do you feel?
It feels good. It's good. I talked a lot.
You got a lot of good stuff out. Yeah, this is good. And I hope people that are listening are excited to read both or at least one of your books this summer.
That sounds fantastic.
That would be a good start.
Great summer reading. Good beach reading.
Thank you again for listening to On Books. This week we had Sam Arbesman on the show. If you want to find out more about Sam, you can go to arbesman.net. That's arbesman.net. I will put the link to this book and his website and all that stuff at on-books.com. That's my website, and you can share it. We can share it together. That's on-books.com. You can email me if you have feedback, if you have thoughts, if you want to just say, hi, what's up? I am Chris at on-books.com. I check all my own email. I'm a big boy. I know how to do that. So you can write me. Let me know what you're thinking. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe. I am on iTunes. Well, we are on iTunes. I just search On Books on iTunes. Just some exciting news in my life. I will be teaching at Columbia University in the fall. So I just became a professor, is what they call it. Yeah, at Columbia in the fall, I'll be teaching a course called Digital Literacy for Decision Makers. It's in the business school. So if you're a Columbia student, you can come and hang and we can talk about digital literacy. But yeah, I'm excited. If you like On Books, please subscribe. You go to iTunes and just download On Books. And really the biggest, most amazing thing that you can do is tell a friend or two, maybe tweet or put it on Facebook if there's an episode you like. That just really helps me out. I love doing the show and sharing it with you. And yeah, the more people I could share it with is amazing. So thank you for being part of this. It's been really fun. And yeah, subscribe on iTunes. I also have YouTube videos that I put up every week. That's youtube.com/Castig. And until then, keep reading.